Oh, so you're talking about women? Must mean you're an Islamophobe. Oh, you're talking about Muslims? Must mean you're an anti-Semite. Competitive model of victimhood, where anytime you talk about one thing, another group says, oh my God, I'm erased by this.
Welcome to The Tea with me, Myriam François, the show where we dig into the story behind the headlines. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of The Tea. If you want to support the show and help shape future episodes, join our Patreon community. Think of it as the resistance. Plus, if you're in our top tier, you'll get access to ad-free episodes. The link's in our bio. In the hot seat today is a woman the Times once called the poster girl for the radical left. To her Tory pundit frenemies, she's known as the Queen of Woke, and if you're anything like me, you'll remember her as the woman who iconically called Piers Morgan an idiot on live TV for suggesting she might quite like Obama, a viral moment many of us cherish deeply. I am, of course, referring to none other than Ash Sarkar, senior editor at Novara Media and a familiar face on British TV and radio. Ash has just dropped her controversial debut book, Minority Rule: Adventures in the Culture War, in which she tears apart, well, arguably everything we've come to know and love her for. In this episode, we'll get into her searing critique of identity politics and woke culture, how social media fuels performative activism over solidarity, the messy reality of anti-Semitism and identity politics weaponization within the Labour left, the rise of far-right narratives around race and class, and the urgent question of how to rebuild collective liberation in a hyper-individualistic world. Ash, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Oh, what an intro. I'm going to be like, turn that into my CV.
Well, I almost changed it this morning to, and the woman who called Tony Blair Satan.
No. Satan was unavailable.
Satan was unavailable. That was the one. I also, an iconic...
Satan's understudy.
Right. Well, even that's debatable. Understudying, who's the understudy for whom at this point? Ashley, firstly, I want to thank you for coming on. I can imagine that it hasn't been the easiest period post the release of this book, because my sense is there's been quite a lot of misunderstanding of what you're communicating. How does it feel on your end?
I don't know. I actually see it really differently. So in terms of the reception to the book, you've had, a small number of right-wingers who have a vested interest in misinterpreting you. So I'm not going to look to them for a sustained, critical, thoughtful engagement. You've got, some people on the left who I think reacted to, one of the things is that people see a critique of identity politics as being a rejection of anti-racism.
Right.
I see it as being the other way around, which is it's standing up for anti-racism and effective movement building by critiquing identity politics. So then there's a smaller number of people who are saying that. Then there were some actually really thoughtful criticisms, which I thought were really useful and pushed me intellectually, and I'm incorporating that into the paperback. And then there's been a lot of people who've been either online or coming up to me in person who've said, I'm really glad you've written this because I've been thinking it for a long time and it felt unsayable. And it felt like we couldn't grapple with the weaknesses in our movement because, we were scared of being socially ostracized. So people say it's controversial. I haven't experienced it as that controversial, but maybe I'm just dumb.
Clearly, your book hit the spot in various ways. Some people had different reactions to it, but you did touch on something that a lot of people have been feeling. There's a TikTok video that's been going viral. I don't know if you saw it, where someone basically asks leftists to name when they heard a hot take that was too woke, quote unquote. And I want to read you some of the responses because they are actually insane. So you probably came across this one because I think you quote it in the book. Anne Frank had white privilege.
White privilege, different problems.
No comment.
she had
didn't work out that well.
It didn't fucking help her.
What the hell? Okay, so walkable cities are fat phobic.
Okay.
Yeah. Wanting a healthy child is ableist.
Nope.
It's offensive to say, hey guys, to people without knowing their gender.
See, comrades, gender neutral.
That helpful. The word crazy is a slur.
Nope.
White folks using reaction gifs of black people as digital blackface.
Well, I mean, the thing is that I think what all of these things have in common, and this is a really important point of the book, is that it comes from a kind of obsession with discourse. And discourse is this sort of distinct idea, which is there are things which are speaking through you, even if you don't intend it. And obviously that's a really important idea and an important form of analysis when you're looking at texts, right? When you're looking at texts or artworks or essays or ideas, discourse analysis is really, really useful. It is a terrible way to interact with actual human beings or to build a political movement. Because the minute you're doing constant discourse analysis, one, is quite paralyzing because it demands that everything stop while you have a look at this thing and you dig into language. Two, it is a mode of suspicion. And I think it creates a sense of precarity and sort of social insecurity. And the third thing is that you can do it forever. I mean, I don't know if you did an arts and humanities degree.
Guilty as charged.
Guilty as charged, right? The seminar can literally go on forever, right? It's an endless amount that you can dig into language and pick apart what someone really meant and think about all the context that are bringing to bear. And so if you're doing that in a either a political space in real life or that's become your preoccupation in terms of how you talk about politics online, you never get to the thing that you actually want to do, which is pursue your strategic objectives.
Right. And okay, so I think a lot of people might push back and say, look, but words are really important, right? And the terminology that we use in movements is also really important.
The thing about words are important is that, like, it's a really blanket statement. And it's, of course words are important, right? If I came in here and, I called you a misogynist slur, I would say that was no good, very bad. Words are important in that regard. But let's say, we know this from personal relationships. When you're having an argument with your partner and you get into that space where you're no longer talking about your disagreement, but you're talking about how they articulated their disagreement. And say, well, it's not, it's not what you said, but it's how you said it. That very rarely gets you to a better place with your partner when you start picking apart every little thing they've said and you're not getting into, well, what made you feel this way? What is the actual substance of our disagreement? How do we move forward? And I suppose this is the point I'm making. It's not saying that language isn't important, but I think that it's been given this sort of like obscene status and it becomes just a pit, like a bottomless pit of attention. And the thing about dealing with human beings, real human beings, is that we use language in ways which are imperfect all the time. All the time. And I think that one of the reasons why perhaps it has this obscene status is that it's a very middle class thing to police other people's language. It's a really middle class thing. And it's a way of bringing in this sort of invisible barrier, which says, unless you talk in this way, you're not really one of us.
So speaking of speaking in a certain way, you'll no doubt have seen Emma Watson in hot water currently over an interview that she gave on the Jay Shetty podcast. She basically opened up about different issues. She condemned the genocide in Gaza, and she also talked about her complicated feelings towards J.K. Rowling's views on transgender. She made it clear that while she opposes J.K. Rowling's views on trans issues, she also kind of was acknowledging that she had a personal relationship and respect and I guess almost love for her at a personal level, and that disagreement couldn't erase that. That's how I understood the interview. But many people online were slamming her and essentially questioning her credibility and her allyship over that, sort of balancing act and not being willing to kind of completely cut ties. To what extent do you view that brouhaha as symptomatic of some of the issues that you talk about?
Well, I think there's a few things going on here. So one is Emma Watson's having to walk a line, one in terms of her own feelings, right? And, her feelings about a woman, without whom she may not have had an acting career of the sort of status and stature and success that she had.
No doubt.
The second thing is that with J.K. Rowling being such a huge cultural figure, is that there are armies of people, and I'm not just talking about online, I'm also talking about newspaper editors, I'm talking about television presenters, I'm talking about columnists, who, if you're seen to be critical of J.K. Rowling, will be like, you ingrate trans activist bitch. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm always suspicious of people making demands of celebrities. Right?
Why?
Because the celebrity can do what you want. And it is not going to change the fact that trans people's access to healthcare, their ability to live and work in dignity, is under wholesale attack. So I think that this is the wrong place to sort of put your efforts. And I think that this speaks to a wider problem, which is that the level of political organization is so low. And I'm not just talking about in terms of trans rights, I'm talking about across the board, that there is a sort of passivity of sort of waiting for, a white knight in a horse to say the right things and make the right intervention. And that's going to make things better. I mean, Emma Watson could have done exactly what you wanted. One, you'd probably still have a problem with it because that's how the engine of social media outrage works. But then the second thing is that it's not actually going to change material conditions for trans people. And I think that this is part of the argument about culture wars, which is the minute you perceive politics as two famous people arguing either on TV or on the internet or something else, the further away you get from actual meaningful political change.
So it's a real dilemma because I think there's a lot of people in this generation who don't think that politicians are anything but stand-ins for, essentially a circus, right? It's not real it's not where the real power is wielded.
And they're right about that.
Right. And we'll also observe that the will of the people as expressed in kind of popular politics, the grassroots stuff, the taking to the streets, the kind of writing to your MPs, meeting with them, sharing kind of your opinions, hasn't shifted anything on kind of core issues. But then on other issues like the digital ID, which nobody asked for, suddenly that's being rolled in. And we're all just like, oh, funny, weren't like all the tech bros in town just a week ago? Like nothing to do with that, I'm sure. But everything to do with what? The democratically elected mandate that you were given by the people. So I'll be honest, I don't blame people for looking to celebs because I think that there is who's left in like the high profile, you have a public platform in which to share views that are not controlled. And I think that's the issue.
And sure, the media space is a space of intervention. And I'm a media person too. That's why I laugh when people call me an activist. I'm like, never done any fucking useful activism for like years and years and years. Like I'm a media person, all right? I too am a little puppet going wah, 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 wah. But that's just one space of intervention. And it's not a place where you can really, at least as an individual, build power. I think you can if you're building an organization. Obviously, that's what we're trying to do with Novara Media. But as an individual, you can't build meaningful power. So when you're saying who's left, I'd go, well, we are like we as in like the people. And I think that this is a really important point, which goes back to the sort of like disaggregated nature of politics and how atomized and individualized it is that in the past the left were very serious about building institutions, organizations, parties. The second thing is, like I said, in the 2010s you had all sorts of movements like in Sao Paulo or Chile, or the movement of the squares, in Quebec, or Tahrir Square, or, Occupy, which was this idea of leaderless horizontal movements, which could become really big really quickly because of social media. But as Vincent Bevins writes in If We Burn, which is a fantastic book, fantastic analysis of this decade, it fizzles out. A vacuum is created and more reactionary forces move in. And he puts it really simply. He's like, look, organised beats disorganised every time. So our lack of organisation, our lack of ability to build institutions, I think has led to this kind of weakness. And that in turn creates this passivity where you're like, Emma Watson, what are you saying about trans rights?
Fine. There's also been a lot of effort to gut popular movements from their ability to actually gain traction, right? We've seen for example, the use of social media platforms as the basis for organizing, right? Tahrir Square was a very good example of activists being able to communicate and organize using Twitter, what was then Twitter, to collectively oppose the regime. Now, that didn't go down not because people weren't organized. It didn't go down because the US got involved and essentially put down what would have been a popular revolution, which, then brought about a political leader that was not someone that the neighbor, in particular America's pit bull in the region, was very happy to see in power.
I think that's true, and that's really important. But one of the things that Bevins writes about Tahrir Square is that part of the reason why kind of like immediately following, like the Muslim Brotherhood are the first beneficiaries of this movement is because they had long-standing organization.
True.
Right? Much more organized. Whereas the sort of, shall we say, more secular, younger aspects of the movement that had sort of first initiated Tahrir Square, who also were thinking about how do we build a society that we want to see in miniature here, were much less organized than this other force. So I don't disagree that American foreign policy was a hugely important force in here. But that sort of focus on the organized, disorganized bit, that also draws parallels with, what happened in Sao Paulo, what happened, following Occupy, what happened following, the Quebec students movement as well. So I think that there are other aspects as well, but that's an important one. Second thing is the reason why I begin the book with the critique of the left, I don't stay there,
Right,
is because I was really interested in how identity became the primary lens through which we understand politics. And I'm not just talking about the left. There is an identity politics of the right. There is an identity politics of the centre. There is an identity politics of Zionism. And all of these things have become so hyper visible. And it's not that I think that we can get away from identity in totality, right? Identity, I always say, it's where self meets culture, right? Like that's what identity fundamentally is. But which identities are salient, how important they are, and the extent to which you think you should sort of stick in your little identity bubble, your ability to reach out beyond it, like these are really, really important political questions.
So how would you sum up your main concern with the ways that identity politics have weakened, from your perspective, the left?
All right. So I sort of spell it out as a form of taking what is kryptonite to the left and making it a virtue. So the left, the only thing we have is each other. The only thing we have is the power of collectivity, solidarity, mutual aid, coordinated action and cooperation. All right. That's all the left has ever had. And without that, we're toast, right? Left-wing movements cannot function. And instead of sort of going, all right, these are the values that we're going to uphold and the ones that we're going to live by, instead it's a sort of competitive model of victimhood. Oh, so you're talking about women? Must mean you're an Islamophobe. Oh, you're talking about Muslims? Must mean you're an anti-Semite. Oh, you're talking about black people? It means you must not care about blah, 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 right? Competitive model of victimhood, where anytime you talk about one thing, another group says, oh my God, I'm erased by this, right? So it makes it impossible to begin a political analysis of any kind. Second thing is lived experience becoming an unassailable form of authority. So rather than it being something like witness testimony, important but not infallible, if someone goes, well, it's my lived experience that this, you go, oh shit, I can't contradict you. And we see this happening time and time again when it comes to Israel's advocates in the States or in Europe or the UK, which is, oh, well, I feel unsafe or uncomfortable because you've said from the river to the sea, or I feel unsafe or uncomfortable because you've had a bake sale for Gaza. It's my lived experience. It's my lived experience that these things are anti-Semitic.
Okay,
obviously an unreasonable thing.
Right. Okay. So let's get into that a little bit. So are you saying that there is an equivalence between what we know to be a well-funded, well-organized attempt to undermine the pro-Palestine movement in this country by people who are deliberately wielding these politics in service to a regressive agenda, support for genocide, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, an equivalence between that, which I would argue is posturing, with actual people of color using their lived experience in a setting where they're and have been undermined their entire life to say, actually, I would like to let you know that, X thing is not acceptable. Not pronouncing my name correctly is a disrespect. Suggesting because I'm black, I should bring my swag to work is offensive, because through that word, which is just a word, I'm also understanding how you perceive me.
No, not an equivalence at all. And I write this in the book. These things are not equivalent, but it is a borrowed playbook. And that's the thing to understand, because one of the things that I think that we started absorbing in the left is that if someone says something, you can't question any anecdote. You can't question, is this thing reasonable? You can't question, is this a good use of our time, right? You can't ask these things, which are essentially analytical questions. And another thing which I think is really important is that many of these things that we're talking about are framed as being about subjective experiences in such a way that I think it means that bandwidth is taken up and taken away from talking about things which impact more working class people of colour, more working class, women or trans people or disabled people or whichever group you want to name.
Right.
Because these things, they tend to really dominate in more bourgeois spaces. And so it's about, how do I feel quite often as a marginalised identity within a middle class space. So many of these ideas in terms of where you find them. So not equivalent, certainly not morally equivalent, right? Being annoying is not morally equivalent with weaponizing experience in support or in order to obscure a genocide. These are not moral equivalents, but it is a borrowed playbook.
But just because it's a borrowed playbook doesn't mean we should throw out the playbook, right? And I guess that's my question to you is is it not the case that actually what needs to be called out is the weaponization of the playbook rather than the playbook itself? To what extent is, this idea that just because there's been this weaponization of identity politics by, I would say, people who are ill-intentioned. They're not saying this because they're actually offended by a Palestinian flag. They're saying it because they don't think a Palestinian flag should be flown in the capital or anywhere else. Mm-hmm. They're not actually offended by pictures, drawings by children in a hospital.
It's weaponized hypersensitivity.
It's weaponized hypersensitivity, but I think that the issue is throwing out the kind of the vehicle as opposed to kind of examining what is actually going on here.
So my point is that there's a sort of twofold critique, right? So one is that this playbook has been identified as being useful precisely because it's post-analytical. It's saying don't ask questions, which is obviously very useful if you want to cheat code politics. Don't ask questions is a really important thing. Second thing is that it obscures, I think, material inequalities. And so that's why this playbook has been appropriated by the right or by, pro-Israel advocates. But also my point is that this vehicle has not taken the left to where we need to go. It has not served us well. So it has meant that we have a political culture internally on the left, which is beset by low stakes, high drama infighting.
So let's talk about Diane Abbott, shall we, for a minute? Because obviously for those who aren't familiar with Diane Abbott, she was Britain's first black female MP and one of its longest serving politicians. For many,
Mother of the House.
Right. For many in the Labour Party, she is considered, a key figure of the movement. And, she made a comment about 2 years ago where she basically argued that racism based on skin color, the kind experienced daily by black and brown people, is not the same as prejudice faced by other groups who are white passing. And she referenced Jewish people, Irish people, and travelers in her comment. Now, she was suspended. These comments resurfaced recently, but you also weighed in on this, you might recall, and you said on LBC that you thought her letter was, I quote, totally indefensible and factually and historically wrong.
Yeah.
Do you still stand by that?
So the part that I really objected to was comparing anti-Semitism and anti-traveller racism to prejudice similar to what might be experienced by ginger people. That was the part which I objected to in the letter. Her subsequent comments where she says, well, obviously it's different if you can identify someone as being, racially or ethnically or, somehow othered straight away. Of course, that part is true. But the reason why I disagreed with the part about comparing it to the prejudice faced by ginger people is that just obviously that's not true, right?
Fine.
If you've got the far right, attacking synagogues or defacing Jewish cemeteries or, reviving Nazi imagery, or, of course, the history of the Holocaust, which is a history of material dispossession and violence, I don't think you can say, well, that's like prejudice faced by ginger people. So that's the part which I found completely indefensible.
So I guess what she's referring to is the idea that there are forms of racism, and I'm going to distinguish here between racism and prejudice, right? There are forms of racism and racism being structural, that literally impact every part of your life if you're a person identified as a person of color in this country. So if you're black and brown, you're more likely to live in poverty, you're more likely to end up in poor housing, educational failure, prison, unemployment, early death, healthy. Yeah, okay. So, right. If you are racialized as white, and particularly, I would say, for the Jewish community, which is part of the wealthier part of our society, I don't think it's right to put them together in the category of racism. Racism structures your life opportunities downwards. If you're Jewish in this country, are you overrepresented in poverty, Ash, in poor housing, in prison statistics, in healthcare inequality, in unemployment figures, in any of those, in any of the areas where we observe systematic structural discrimination? Do we find an overrepresentation of Jewish people?
So I think the first thing that I would say is that obviously the Jewish community isn't a monolith. And as far as I understand it, you don't find overrepresentation of any part of the Jewish community particularly. Like, you don't find overrepresentation in the criminal justice system.
No.
Second thing is that I think it's important to talk about the differences in contemporary racism. Hugely important. And I've written about this and I've taken shit for it myself, which is to say, look, if you're Jewish, I think that you can face racism, but it's not going to have those downstream consequences of discrimination in the employment market.
So prejudice versus racism.
But the reason why I think it's important to use the word racism here is because the Holocaust is still in living memory. And I also think that the kind of violence that Jewish people can be subject to, I don't think it is right to simply call that a form of prejudice, because I think that racism is, yes, talking about contemporary structures is important, but that historical antecedents, right, that connection to, centuries and centuries of anti-Semitism culminating with the Holocaust, I think is relevant to understanding the kinds of violence that Jewish people face. I don't see this, by the way, as like some kind of competition. Like, calling anti-Semitism a form of racism doesn't it doesn't take anything away from me as a woman of color or a Muslim woman.
Of course it doesn't. But let's be clear on why this is important. So just to recap on this. So racism as opposed to prejudice is what structures negative outcomes for your life. This is not true for Jewish people as a group in this country. Prejudice is what things that are not very nice, but they don't lead to negative outcomes in your life. And the reason it's important to discuss them distinctly is because when we talk about an anti-racism movement and the people who receive, precedence in financial terms, who receive precedence in political debates over their feelings and the ways that they should be prioritized, it's important to understand that there is a difference between a Black woman whose life opportunities are absolutely structured towards, discrimination at every single stage of her life, from a white passing Jewish person who is more likely to actually exist within the more privileged tiers of our society.
So I think talking about the differences in terms of how racism manifests for different communities, yes, important.
That's what we're talking about, yeah.
I don't accept that because it doesn't have the dimension of discrimination in the employment market and material dispossession at this point in history, that it means it's not racism. That's where we disagree.
Sure.
And then I think there's a third element here, which is if you talk about, the Gypsy and Traveller community here in the UK, white skin, white passing. I mean, it seems weird to say white passing. You'd say they're white. But in terms of overrepresentation in all of these things you're talking about, criminal justice system, deprivation, outcomes in education, I mean, I think that it's, and, even little, I mean, it's not a little thing, but when travellers turn up at, my local pub in Tottenham, the pub will literally shut down rather than serve them. Right, will literally shut down.
So travellers also do statistically continue to experience structural racism, and I think obviously there's a big difference between what happened post-Holocaust, where the Jewish community did receive reparations and continues to rightly receive reparations for the horrors that were committed against them. The traveller community did not, right?
Yeah.
So we've not seen a commensurate recovery of their economic and social standing. I think the question today is where we stand in terms of a society that is riddled with inequality, and the idea that somehow we have to pretend that white passing people are experiencing some of the worst forms of racism.
But I completely agree with you there, right? And I've said this, right? My view is that Jewish people experience racism. How they experience racism at this point in history is really different from other groups. Really, really different from other groups. This reminds me of an argument that I had with David Baddiel ages ago, which is when I tried to spell out, the way in which racism is playing out for Jewish people right now is different from, one, other points in history, and two,
of course,
and two, different from other, racialized minority groups. Is that he was like, well, that's, are you just saying Jewish people are rich? Is this not a form of anti-Semitism? And I was like, well, pointing out the differences isn't creating a hierarchy. I sort of don't understand why the space I'm in, where I'm like, it's a form of racism, but how it plays out is different, is sort of a unreasonable position.
Well, and that's a really important question to pose, Ash, because there's a couple of things here. One is that these debates are not just theoretical. They manifest in where money is distributed and public attention is distributed in fighting inequality within our society. Let's be honest, Jews comprise 0.5% of the population of this country, but fully 20% of the 100 richest Brits in 2014. Currently, out of the top 50 people on the 2025 Sunday Times Rich List, 13 were Jewish billionaires, which is literally 26% of the list. Now, good for them. Fantastic that the Jewish community is thriving. And I think we also need to figure out who are the primary victims of racism in our society and not allow hyperprivileged groups to hijack the movement.
Or hyperprivileged individuals.
Sure, but also groups, collectives. It's really important to think about this also as sort of the funneling of money to support individual groups to recalibrate inequalities. And when certain groups get huge amounts of government funding to combat anti-Semitism as a primary form of racism, my concern is that, well, is this actually the group that is most vulnerable to racism in our society today, and therefore worthy of being centered in virtually every conversation, to the extent that actually the narratives of other measurably more vulnerable groups in our society are overridden in favor of this group's interests that seem to align not just with political and economic elites, but in this case, with often the interests of a genocidal foreign government.
But I think that this point is the really, really important one, right? Because I see it all the time with my friends who are Jewish and are anti-Zionist. The protective mantle of combating anti-Semitism never seems to include them. So people can call them self-hating Jews. People can accuse them. I mean, I'm talking about some of the most disgusting things I've seen being lobbed at my friends.
We've seen it directed at them.
Being called capos, being called, useful idiots for Nazis. I mean, this protective mantle never really seems to include them somehow. And I think that this is an important point, and it sort of speaks to an interesting historical shift. Now, racists often have to pretend that they're the real anti-racists. Right. And it happens time and time again. So they'll be like, oh, we're the real anti-racists, but actually we're using the language of anti-racism to further our cause of doing racism. That's what I think pro-Israel advocacy is essentially about. I also think that that's what you're sort of seeing with this, like, oh, it's anti-white racism and stuff like that, right? Like, it's a way of, you said, oh, once upon a time it was socially unacceptable to be a racist. I still think it is. And that's why racists have to pretend that they're actually the real victims of racism, like that, because it is still socially unacceptable to be like, I'm an out-and-out racist. And so when it comes to, and I talk about the organizations who lead this stuff. I talk about the Anti-Defamation League. I talk about UK Lawyers for Israel. You can also add to that groups Camera and BICOM. Obviously, there's Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel, all these different organisations. Campaign Against Antisemitism, of course. When they're talking about anti-Semitism, and you can go through the reports that they write where they'll say, anti-Semitism's gone up by 500%. Go through and look at the examples of anti-Semitism they cite, because they create an equivalence. And they create an equivalence between an attack on a synagogue or an attack on a Hasidic woman with her children. They equate that to a meeting about BDS at a university, or a pro-Palestine demonstration, or a bake sale for Gaza. Mm-hmm. So it's fascinating when you dig into this stuff and you look at the sort of intellectual dishonesty behind a lot of it. I mean, and this is why, if I can give people watching this any word of advice, it's always look behind the headline statistics. Look behind them. Do that for everything.
Yeah. But the issue is then that the main political parties continue to centre those concerns, albeit that they have been skewed by a form of intellectual dishonesty as to what's actually occurring on the ground. And that has material consequences.
And they only do it when it's pro-Israel. So I was really against the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism being adopted by the Labour Party. I was against it when not many people were.
Which, for those who are not aware, is that which equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
So there are something like 11 examples, and I think 5 or 6 of them have to do with how you talk about Israel. So it's really stacking the deck. It's really, really stacking the deck.
Yeah. And we've seen this legislation brought in America right now, where on certain university campuses, you basically have to sign off on the fact that you won't criticize Israel because it would be anti-Semitic.
And I'm always I'm very skeptical of sentences that start with always or start with never. I tend to be skeptical of that because I'm like, okay, well,
there may be a day.
So there may be a day. And one of the things was making comparisons between the state of Israel and Nazi Germany. And the thing is that I don't like rules based in discourse and abstraction, which is like, well, you can never say this. But what if Israel is carrying out genocide? What if Israel is, walling off cities and bombarded them from the sky? Because then there are salient points of comparison.
Also, exceptionalism. Can we just ask the obvious question of why any given state would be ring-fenced from criticism?
Oh my God! I mean, it's like if someone were to criticize, Saudi Arabia's, use of beheadings to deal with criminals, or like how women are treated, or how, Nepalese and Bangladeshi migrants are treated, and I was like, actually, that's Islamophobic.
Islamophobic. But also, we just know that would never run.
I would never fucking.
It would never run.
But this stuff needs to be pointed out, and I think this is what I mean by the playbook, right? Is that I object to the play, and I think it's important for me to be like, I object to the playbook when it's my side, and I also object to the playbook when it's your side.
Where I think there's an issue with the current discourse on kind of the critique of identity politics is that I think that part of the issue that we have has been to integrate the concerns of actually socially and economically privileged people into the anti-racism movement and give them equal credence in the movement when their interests are fundamentally disaligned with the actual emancipation of the movement itself.
The point I'm making, and this is really important to come back to, is that let's take let's take the sort of weaponization of identity by, pro-Israel advocates out of it entirely for a second. Just let's look at what identity politics has done within our movements, right? So like parking that for a second. And this is why I have a critique which isn't just based on the weaponization of identity politics by right-wingers or pro-Israel advocates. This is also why I have a problem with it on its own terms in our spaces.
Yeah.
And I suppose the thing which I think can get us out of it, and I think that this is super important, is a different way of looking at things, right? One is building forms of organization which bring people into contact with one another, not on the internet, right? Real life interactions between people are really important. So like me and you have just had a debate, right? And we've had one where we both feel really, really passionately. But I don't feel threatened by you.
Thank God for that.
There's actually a gun to my head that you can see. Just I can't see
in the
how
background. Yeah, don't tell them.
I don't feel threatened by you at all. I don't feel threatened by you, and I haven't lost sight of your humanity. And while I have that like adrenaline response, I'm like, oh my God, I'm having a debate. I've not lost sight of the fact that we're two people having this debate because actually we care about the same thing.
For
right?
sure.
So in order to get around, what I think are the problems of identity politics, which are made worse by social media, first, building real life organizations, institutions where you're brought into contact with other people. It teaches you a healthy way to do conflict.
But isn't the Labour Party exactly that? Just to use or any political party, like what went wrong within the Labour Party? Because that was let's talk about it, Ash, because that was real people coming together in real settings who should have been able to talk amongst themselves and, frankly, from my perspective, say to someone, okay, sweetheart, we understand that you've been told to come here and cry about a flag, but we're just not going to hold space for that because that's bullshit. So there's a pack of tissues. We're here for you when you're ready. Take a couple of deep breaths and you're welcome back in the circle.
If we're talking about healthy conflict and healthy social interactions, the Labour Party is not where I'd fucking look for it. It is a machine powered on factional warfare, right? I'm not a Labour Party member. I'm not a Green Party member. I'm not a Your Party member. I'm a No Party member. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is how can you build a better political culture, right? Healthy attitude to conflict. And I think a really important part of it is an idea of comradeship. So someone being a comrade, there are elements of friendship. There are elements of professionalism, right? Because it's a shared sense of purpose, but it's also more than both of those things.
So the problem then is that the Labour Party, well, today we know has become obviously I'd say a centrist party. I don't know if you would agree with that. Obviously, YouGov.
I'd say it's a right-wing party.
Okay, there you go. So YouGov analysis shows that Britain's earning over £70,000 are now more likely to vote Labour than any other party, which is a surprising reversal, certainly in UK trends. And working class and lower income voters are increasingly turning to reform, as we know. We're seeing everyone kind of losing their mind, surprisingly not in a despairing way, about Nigel Farage being very likely to be the next Prime Minister of the UK. If Labour today is a centre-right or right-wing party and, your party is, I'm just going to put a question mark, I don't even know how to end the sentence, the Greens, TBC, the Greens, Independents, like where are the comrades to organise, Ash?
Neoliberalism was, at its heart, was a wholesale attack on every level on working class power. So that's the thing, is that the working class will always be the bigger class. People that have to live off wages and live off work is always going to be a bigger class than people who can live off wealth, right? Stuff they already own. So the key is to make sure that they never unite, that they never form a shared project. And, part of how the neoliberal revolution worked was to attack the trade unions, significantly weaken them, introduce laws which severely restrict collective bargaining. The destruction of heavy industry in this country, it wasn't just the destruction of workplaces, it was the destruction of communities. So like where my husband is from in South Yorkshire, it's big coal mining territory, right? And also the steelworks and coal mining. When the steel mills were shut down and the coal mines were shut down, you know what replaced it? Basically nothing.
Right.
Basically nothing. Right. Now you're getting a little bit of like, the Amazon warehouses are moving in.
Delightful.
Right. Which is, a form of work which is so degraded, right? It's low paid. They don't even let you go to the fucking toilet when you need to go. It's a very different culture that's created by that. If you go to other parts of the North, and this is something which I think is really important for when you're thinking about community tensions, is that, obviously there was racism, huge amounts of community tensions, huge amounts of conflict in the 70s and 80s. I'm not looking at that as the glory days.
Right.
But when the forms of work which replace factories and mills, which at least people would have to encounter each other in a workplace or in a trade union, when that's replaced by people having to drive taxis or Uber, like super atomized and isolating as a form of work,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that then changes your ability to meet people, see they're not scary, see they're human beings. And so I think all these problems that we're dealing with, many of the problems that we're dealing with in this country, which also include problems of racism and rising, and the rise in far right, a lot of it, I think, flows downstream from these attacks on working class forms of power, organisation, community institutions.
Isn't part of the challenge now, though, that the working class you're talking about is now more likely to vote reform? Many of them were out on the streets, literally chanting, kick the Muslims out, F is like there was a lot of very clearly racist, anti-Muslim sentiment being expressed by these communities. You talk in the book, using the example of the Panthers and Fred Hampton, of this sort of, cross collaboration across lines. But I wonder where you would place where would you place the line in the sand, if at all? And I ask this as somebody who's observed, obviously, and I'm sure you've seen the same, that anytime parties engage with, and political parties in particular, engage with the far right, it is not the case that the far right becomes more moderate. It is systematically the case that those parties end up veering more towards the far right. And so at this particular point in history, where I would argue we are literally facing an existential threat to the very makeup of our societies, meaning free, open democracies, I think that people may not realize how far along we are the autocratic surveillance state takeover by literal fascists who believe in eugenics, right?
In the early 2000s, as you might remember, people weren't talking about the forgotten white working class. People were talking about chavs. And people were talking about people who were white and working class as though they were disgusting. And I remember watching Little Britain or Vicky Pollard. The image in the media at that time of people who were white and working class was, you are criminal, you're degenerate, you're disgusting, you're promiscuous. And what was painted about those people wasn't, and you're under attack from multiculturalism. There was actually this idea of they had become black or ethnic somehow. So David Starkey, notoriously during the 2011 riots, said the whites have become black. And I think that he perfectly distilled that elite way of thinking about white working class people at the time, which is, you're so disgusting, you've become black. There was such profound racism in that classism that I really had to get my head around it when I was writing the book. And then not long after, and I think that the reasons behind this were, the post-2008 financial crisis. It means social mobility, that train stopped. If you're not middle class now, you're not going to be. Second thing is the sort of, rise of Jeremy Corbyn as a political force. Another thing is Brexit. Is that and when I say the same journalists, I'm not just talking the same newspapers, I'm saying the exact same journalists. They went from going, look at chavs, aren't they disgusting, to going, the white working class have been held in contempt for too long. And they switched up the story. They switched it up from going, look at these white working class people, they're disgusting, they're chavs because they're too close to black people, to then going, white working class people have been betrayed by multiculturalism and anti-racism. Right? So this construction where we think about the working class as white and as having, completely different interest culturally from people with whom they share economic conditions. That is a construction of elites in this country.
If you're enjoying the show, why not join our Patreon community? The Tea is more than just a YouTube show. It's a space to foster meaningful change together. By becoming a member, you're supporting that mission. And if you join our top tier, you'll get exclusive ad-free episodes too. So join us now, link in our bio. In your book, you write a lot about your skepticism around DEI, which I think is valid, and people are
brown faces in high places.
There's been a lot of critique on this, but I just want to push back slightly on it by pointing out that after the BLM protests, S&P 100 companies added over 323,000 jobs in 2021, and 94% of those did go to people of color. According to Bloomberg, it wasn't just entry level either. More than half of the new exec roles went to people of color, and their share of higher level jobs rose by 2 percentage points. Not huge, still ideally in the right direction. More than double the usual annual increase. Similarly, we saw some things after the Me Too movement between 2017 and 2024. Female leadership in FTSE 350 firms jumped by over 10%. And by 2019, women held more than a quarter of senior management roles globally. So although there's a lot to be said about the pitfalls of DEI, and there have also been some actual measurable outcomes that have been positives for communities of color, have there not?
Okay, first thing is, I do not give a fuck about female CEOs. I do not.
Of course you don't.
No.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
Tell me how much your cleaner earns. Tell me what kinds of conditions they're working under. I do not care about the C-suite. I do not care. You could have every single person in there be, you know, a woman who's Muslim, who blah, 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 blah.
So representation politics, you think, has no value?
I think that there might be a psychological impact of it, a sort of psychological compensation of, oh, if I can see myself, it means that I don't see myself as being fully abject. But I'm a Marxist. I do not care about the colour of the capitalist class. I don't. And also the other thing about being South Asian is that I'm seeing an Indian capitalist class. I'm seeing your Mittals and the people who are close to Modi and all the rest of it. I'm not thinking, oh, well, this is so good for us. I mean, like, I care about working class people. That is what I care about. I care about people who have to live off wages. And when, you know, you take, say, Sheryl Sandberg, right? Lean in, she wrote Lean In and she went off to work for Facebook, right? I don't care about Sheryl Sandberg. I care about the Filipino women working content moderation, having to look at images of rape and violence and racist abuse, and who are literally having nervous breakdowns because of it, all while being paid nothing. I care about the Latin American cleaners in the City of London. I do not give a fuck about the top floor.
Okay, so I obviously broadly agree with this, and I think that there's one of the challenges that you would face, obviously, as a Marxist in our current environment, is that everyone is literally hooked on, you know, capitalist, hyper achievement. So everyone wants to be a billionaire. Everyone wants to be on 10 holidays a year. Everyone wants to live the luxe lifestyle. There is, you know, we are being drip fed constantly this sort of aspirational life. And I think it's part and parcel, whether we acknowledge it or not, of what we've integrated as our perception of success. And alongside that, I acknowledge where we are, which is that we are in the late stages of capitalism. I would ask, given where we are, given the systems that we operated in, you know, strategically, there are these issues of representation that come up. I don't know if you recently saw that Jay-Z and Beyonce had joined Ivanka and Jared at this big Reform Alliance gala, and they were seated at the same table, and there was a lot of conversation happening. Is it better that we do have Jay-Z and Beyonce sitting at that table, or is it better if they weren't at that table?
Do you feel better because of it? Oh, okay, all right. So the first thing is, like, when it comes to Beyonce and Jay-Z, my only expectation of them is drop a good album. That's it. Like, I do not expect them, people who have been very clear about their alignment with capital, right? I mean, Beyonce was the face of Pepsi for a really long time.
I mean, she said nothing throughout the entire genocide and dropped an album with her draped in the American
right.
flag.
I mean,
I think there's a lot of things
I just don't have any expectations of that. You know, if we're saying, well, it's good to be at the table and it's good to be seen, you know, as a South Asian woman, was I supposed to look at Suella Braverman and be like, we made it to the top of the mountain? What?
No, but did it also send a message that actually these spaces are now going to be more open, or do we think it's just window dressing?
If you administer the racism,
right.
That's the condition, right? Why is it that we've had a majority of our Home Secretaries be people of colour since the Windrush scandal?
Well, you tell me.
I can tell you. It's because it means they can go, oh, well, it can't be racist, the fact that I'm deporting your grandmother who's worked her whole life here because I'm a person of colour. Because I think you said that, like, you know, giving people the vantage point or the sort of, authority from which to speak, that's a form of power. if it's a form of power, it hasn't achieved anything concrete, and it hasn't achieved anything with deep roots. And this is my point. Real power comes from a different place.
I suppose that's the question is, I gave you some statistics earlier around kind of recruitment in post BLM, but also post Me Too, which I think, again, it'd be interesting to look at the breakdown of those figures across industries and whether it's reflected primarily in white collar spaces, which no doubt it is. I don't think there's any dispute that capitalism consistently co-opts any anti-racism initiative to limit its reach. And I personally regard DEI as the prime capitalist co-optation, which allows, us to focus in primarily on individualized guilt over structural change. What I guess I would mitigate the perspective with slightly is that I do also think that, the structures of whiteness that we exist in are premised on hierarchies of human value, which are so deeply embedded in our psyche that they are then reflected almost unconsciously within our economic systems. And so I do think that both things can operate simultaneously, meaning I do think that there is still value in asking, people racialized as white to consider the implications of their whiteness in given settings, of their status, be it male, be it cis, be it white, and the impact of that in the way that they communicate with other members of staff. I think learning about what other people find important and unimportant is decentering yourself. I think that's also important. So I guess what I'm saying is, of course, it's not going to solve racism, but doesn't it still have some value?
I think the first point that I think is really important to insist on, I have more in common and more shared interests with a Tommy Robinson supporter than I do Lakshmi Mittal, right? Just because I share the same skin colour as a South Asian capitalist billionaire elite does not mean we have shared interests. And I think the fact that you can see a Beyonce or a Jay-Z breaking bread with, Jared and Ivanka, it shows you that the color that matters is the green of the dollar, right? Once you get to that really elite level. And my point is that, this difference, this gap between me and the Tommy Robinson supporter, because, I exist on the street, I exist in real life spaces. It's frightening, right? But that difference is this big. The difference between me and Lakshmi Mittal is this big. So that's my first point. And I think that really helps us set some strategic objectives. That doesn't mean giving up on anti-racism at all. It's just me saying that, okay, if me and this particular relative who I have in mind, actually, when it comes to the economic stuff, really, really align, what if the experience of working together politically on that stuff actually brings us closer on the immigration stuff? And my point is that this is what the Black Panthers showed, is that shared struggle, shared economic struggle, actually brought them closer to people that had the Confederate flag as their symbol, and they gave up the Confederate flag out of respect.
But they didn't support the Confederacy. They didn't want to return to slavery, right? They were using it as a symbol of Southern identity. They weren't people who ultimately believed in the white supremacy that maintained slavery.
No, this is really, really true. This is really true. And I suppose the point I'm making is that I think when we're talking about, this takes us back to discourses, right? Like, we would view someone using that flag in a really different way today. I don't think we would give them the grace of being like, oh, they don't mean it in that way, right?
That possibly not.
I mean, definitely not.
For sure.
Definitely not.
I don't disagree. I think it would probably, unfortunately, be an immediate dismissal. But I think where it's complicated and where, I'll be honest, I am not as magnanimous as you with the Tommy Robinson one, because I'm in a similar situation in my own life, is that I am not ready to sit down with somebody who wishes harm on me, my friends, my family, my child, my community. I'm not prepared to sit down and talk to you with love and compassion. And this could well be a personal failing, but I think that the basic respect that we have to have in coming to the table is at the very least, the recognition of a common humanity, meaning at the very least, you recognize I have as much right to sit here and talk to you as you have to come and sit here and talk to me. From the minute we're approaching the discussion of, you know, I'm a superior race and I will tell you how this shit runs, and I'm literally talking about other white people talking to me as a white person because I'm a Muslim in that way. So it even extends to that.
Yeah.
Which is
I
wild.
mean, whiteness is conditional as a whole thing.
Right. And so in that sense, I just think I don't know how we ask people who are fearing for their lives, fearing for their children's lives, fearing for their communities, to sit down and talk to people who will literally sit opposite you and say, you know, get out of my country, Islam isn't welcome here, you know, you're scum, you know, and so we're supposed to kind of accept a regression.
Who's saying accept? Who's saying accept? I'm not saying accept. The thing I'm saying is something different, which is if I sit down with a Tommy Robinson supporter and the discussion is immigration, the discussion is national identity, the discussion is race, okay? Because it's raising the salience of the issues that divide us.
Mm-hmm.
If I sit down with a Tommy Robinson supporter and instead we're talking about the economy, we're talking about how the rich get away with everything, we're talking about how they haven't been able to like find a job for the past 12 months, we're talking about this other stuff, we're starting from a different place. It doesn't mean that immigration isn't important. It doesn't mean you don't have those conversations. But the first conversation you have is something different. And this is the thing, is that I think that it's really hard. If you say, okay, a recognition of my humanity is the condition of us sitting down together. I mean, the thing is that racism is powerful and it's been here for centuries. Sexism is powerful, it's been here for centuries. Homophobia is powerful and it's been here for centuries. We're starting.
Which is what DEI was trying to teach them not to replicate.
But I also think that I think it failed to do that.
Sure.
It failed. And that's because it was the wrong approach. It was the wrong approach. I'm not sitting here going, and the fact someone is racist, it's fine. I'm saying, actually, if you want to deal with racism, you have to create a common cause with them first. First you create a common cause. And the other things will come.
But do you remember, Ash, there was a time where it was like kind of shameful to be a racist? We've long past that point. I feel like we need to bring back it being shameful to be a racist. I feel like, you know, if anything, and I don't have particularly high expectations of the DEI courses that people go on, but if at the very least it could, you know, result in people coming out and saying, yeah, I shouldn't really say that.
People who are racist feel really emboldened. And there's also, I mean, I don't know how to quite phrase this, but people feel emboldened in all sorts of ways. They're not hardened far-right people, but they have hate in their hearts, which has come from resentment and come from ways in which they've been failed by society as well. And the way in which they express it is just, you know, I mean, it happened to some friends of mine recently in a pub. They were there with their baby. And this guy who was clearly like mentally really unwell was like pointing at the baby and making throat-slitting gestures. Now, I don't think that guy had been on the Tommy Robinson march, but he'd been emboldened by the climate. It changed how he felt able to act. I think that...
And even our Prime Minister's response to them.
I mean, look,
hello.
Well, you are not going to find me agreeing with that at all.
I know.
The thing that I'm saying is that I also don't want what is hyper-visible to be taken as the overall direction of travel of what most people are thinking and feeling.
I mean, how many people were on that march? This police counts 150,000.
150,000.
People claim it was like close to 1 million.
I mean, it wasn't
a million, but it was certainly a lot of people.
Right, it was a lot of people. If you think about the organised far right, they put their all into it. For me, the question is this: is 150,000 their ceiling, or is there more for them to grow from that? That's a question. I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know. I just think that, like, I think we also owe it to ourselves to accept that, like, you know, it is actually a lot less socially accepted. You know, you say, oh, I remember when racists had to whisper. I mean, I also remember when I was growing up and like people were calling me and my mum Packy and like pissing on our door and putting lit cigarettes through. Like those are my memories of like the late 90s, early 2000s. I just think that sometimes you have to be able to hold loads of really contradictory things in the frame at once. One is the rising power of the far right. The other is that actually, feelings around racial tolerance are getting better, whilst also at the same time Islamophobia is getting worse. All these things, they don't work in one coherent direction. They're like EQ levels. One can go up, one can go down. You have to make sense of the specific circumstances you're in. But one of the things that I really hope that I do in my writing is make space for contradiction and the contradictory elements of how racism operates.
You mentioned the other chapters in the book, and I think there's a fantastically powerful chapter of the book that talks about the lobby. And the lobby I didn't know very much about, but basically is a system in which a select group of political journalists are granted privileged access to Westminster in order to mingle with politicians and essentially get the inside scoop on different stories. Only I didn't fully realize that basically this is a hyper incestuous world where basically they're all fucking each other and are literally all like holidaying with each other and
Tuscany.
like relatives and whatever else. So Ed Balls, there was this example you gave of Ed Balls, a former politician, part broadcaster, interviewing his wife, who was then Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, in 2024. Normal, just standard, afternoon political interview. Or Allegra Stratton went from Newsnight editor to government spokesperson and back again to journalism post Partygate scandals. Now, these are just two examples. The chapter is extremely rich in revealing what I would, highly advise people to read into to understand why there is such a deformed form of politics in this country, and why the media, legacy media today, for me, is a reflection of elite political interest, and largely a wing of, sadly, propaganda for those interest groups or individuals. To what extent today do you feel that, and if you could share a bit about what you learned about the lobby yourself, to what extent has it convinced you that the type of political discourse that even you or I might be engaged in legacy media spaces is a form of controlled opposition? It really isn't actually engaging with substantive issues.
So, I mean, that's a really great question. I mean, first to start with the lobby. So I think the lobby has actually become a lot more powerful in setting the political agenda of the day. Obviously, it's having to compete with the sort of, unfiltered flow of information on social media. But in terms of being able to really lead politicians by the nose, the lobby is really powerful. And that's because of what's happened to newsrooms overall. So because the economic foundation of media has just fallen away, completely fallen away, organic news gathering is really expensive. So how that plays out in terms of current affairs coverage is that the commentary ring is really big. And where you do have news gathering capacity, it's all centred in this country on Westminster. So the lobby and the political correspondents, they lead the news desk. So then that becomes, what is the news of the day? It's the who's up, who's down, and it's a really, really narrow group of people setting the agenda. Ideologically very conformist. The window of opinion is sort of centre-leftish to hard right. That's the sort of window of reasonable opinion amongst the lobby. Disproportionately privately educated. And there are also incentives and disincentives for going with the herd. So let's say that you're the Prime Minister's spokesperson. If I really want to get an answer out of you, I need 3 or 4 or 5 more journalists to all ask the same question, because then that says to the spokesperson and therefore the government, oh, this is a really important issue. So if this one is asking about Rachel Reeves's haircut, and this one is asking about Rachel Reeves's haircut, and this one's asking about Rachel Reeves's haircut, and I'm asking about welfare cuts, right? Rachel Reeves's haircut is the important story. Welfare cuts isn't. So that is how it works, right? And so it's to do with ideology, it's to do with the coziness and the chumminess and the close connections, and it's also to do with career incentives. And there's an interesting dimension of this, which it's really annoying when you write a book, because sometimes you publish it and then you're like, fuck, I should have said this. One is that the value of a lobby journalist to their employer, the newspaper, is the quality of their contact book. So if I have dinner at Ed and Yvette's, a couple of times a year, and I'm really close to Morgan McSweeney, and I've got the ear of so and so who works in I don't know, the Treasury, I'm getting those access stories from powerful people, which makes me valuable to my employer. So then if Jeremy Corbyn comes along and threatens to become Prime Minister, and then it means my contact book is worthless, because what's the fucking point of hobnobbing with Ed and Yvette if it's Diane Abbott who's going to be, Home Secretary? It then creates an alignment of incentives. So I need my contact books to still be as valuable, and my contact book needs these guys to not go anywhere near power, so they've still got careers. So that changes how the coverage kind of works. But I only had that idea after I'd already published the book, which was so annoying.
Well, there's lots in that I would highly recommend people engage with. And so, based on that, I guess, is my last question to you, which is around, the basis for change. I think if we can agree on everything, if we can agree on anything across the board, in this society right now, and God knows there are lots of fractures, I think there is a sense that something has to change at quite a profound level. And institutional politics, formal political parties, for many people, myself included, look in disarray.
Yeah, come on, look at them.
What is happening with your party? I'd like to vote for the Greens, but do we think the Greens can run the country? Labour is off the deck for me personally, but who knows?
I'd rather shoot myself in the fucking face than vote for this Labour
it's looking
Party.
Pretty rough out here. And at the same time, the reason I also wanted to ask you this specifically is because obviously, luxury communism, right, is your objective out here. And I was wondering, how do you see the path towards change? Given how rigged the system, the mainstream political system is, and your book is very clear on that, if it wasn't clear enough for those of us observing what's been happening. But also, how do you sell communism or socialism to a generation online who is obsessed with becoming billionaires, obsessed with luxury lifestyle, absolutely individualistic? Your book does a wonderful job of talking about how the platforms that we engage with one another on encourage hyper individualism and branding. So how do we bring about the ideal of a more egalitarian future when everyone just doesn't want to pay taxes?
So the first thing is what are the kinds of organisations which are important? I do actually think a form of political party is important. The problem for me, the essential problem with your party is that we inherited the leadership from Labour. So Jeremy Corbyn, and it doesn't mean that they're bad people or they don't have their virtues. I mean, very resilient people who had to, cling on in the face of just a horrible storm. I mean, I think that the Labour Party doesn't necessarily select for the kinds of leaders that would be good for a democratic, socialist, grassroots mass membership party, because that's not what the Labour Party is. The Labour Party, if you manage to succeed in it, is because you've been good at navigating factional warfare, which is not the kind of political culture you'd want in a new party.
But also because socialism is a really hard sell today. Nobody that I know even engages with the word.
Well, look, I mean, I think that whether or not they engage with the word, I actually think there's a lot which feels really intuitively true to people.
So that I agree.
The majority of conservative voters are in favour of a wealth tax, right?
Yeah, no, but this is what I mean. When I guess what I was trying to get at is how do you sell, communism, even if it's luxury communism, when you're talking to young people, they are drinking, many of us, I'm not even excluding myself out here, we're all drinking the capitalist Kool-Aid.
I think that I actually start from a different place. I'm very open about my politics because I just think that the minute you're dishonest about something, that's going to land you in trouble. So I'm open and I say, I'm a Marxist, I'm a communist, this is where I'm coming from. But when I'm looking to persuade people, I actually don't start with, I'm a communist, come and join me on Mount Communism. I start with actually things that feel true in your life. So I think that anyone who uses social media feels emotionally empty. We all feel that there is this void, and I do it all the time, right? Like if I'm having a moment of like self-doubt or self-loathing, I start scrolling and then I feel worse and then I start shopping because I just think one more dress.
Definitely read the comments in those moments.
Right? One more pair of shoes, one more thing. If I buy one more thing, it's gonna fill this hole that's in my heart. Beyond that, people talk about the way in which social media has atrophied our ability to be together in real life. And I mean, we talked about it in terms of conflict, right? It's made people a lot worse at dealing with conflict because you feel so under threat when you're in social media. But it's also made people more anxious. I mean, dating apps, like no one's on the dating apps and feels great about being on the dating apps, right? And that's the place where I tend to start from with people. I don't tend to start, if I'm doing something like Newsnight or Politics Live, sure, I'll talk about a wealth tax. But when I'm trying to talk to people about like actually what I believe in, which is that turning things that we value into commodities degrades them and poisons them and hollows them out from within, I start with all this other stuff because I think there's a policy consensus around the wealth tax, but I think there is a moral consensus around this other stuff.
Well, look, Ash, we could talk for hours, but I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you for having me. And also thank you for demonstrating that people can have a political argument and still be boys. Pressure makes diamonds. I mean, I know that sounds really Jose Mourinho, but it does. And like, we get better ideas by putting them under scrutiny.
Well, on that note, thank you once again, Ash. And thank you for joining us today. In a world where trust in journalism is at an all-time low and corporate and political powers try to control the stories we hear, independent voices like ours are more vital than ever. At The Tea, our goal is to challenge misinformation and open up alternative discussions, minus the polarization. If this episode sparked your curiosity or challenged the way you think, hit subscribe now because you won't want to miss what's next. And why not join our community on Patreon to enjoy ad-free episodes and exclusive content? Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking the truth, and we'll see you soon for the next episode of The Tea. Thanks for tuning into The Tea. If this episode resonated with you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And why not dive into these other episodes that we think you'll love? Let's keep the conversation going.